Hello, my friends. Welcome back to another live book reading. This is certainly something I never saw myself doing even once in my life. Never mind coming back for round two. I appreciate you joining me once again for this. So, for anybody who was paying attention last time, you know I read the 1976 novelization of Star Wars, and I took a few weeks off to work on some other projects. And silly me, I actually thought, I think that was 3 weeks ago that I finished that book, and I think at that point there was even some thought in my mind like, oh, we'll have this virus thing kicked by 3 weeks. We'll be back to normal life, but we're not. So let's read some more books, right? So I was planning on reading either The Empire Strikes Back, or I had also purchased my first ever Star Wars Expanded Universe novel, which is actually the first Star Wars Expanded Universe novel. This book called Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was originally written to be the follow-up to A New Hope, had A New Hope not been a success. It was written to be produced as a low-budget sequel. So I put a poll on Instagram and Facebook, because I was also considering James Bond. I at my live music show last week, I had a request for some James Bond music, and it definitely put me in. So I played the theme to You Only Live Twice. It put me in the mood for James Bond. But I put the poll on Instagram and Facebook, do you want to hear more Star Wars, or would you like to hear some James Bond? And I definitely expected Star Wars to beat out Bond. And then I was going to follow up that poll with another one about, would you rather hear The Empire Strikes Back or Splinter of the Mind's Eye? But what happened is my Instagram poll went 78% in favor of 007, which was a shock to me. Maybe people just have Star Wars fatigue from Disney, promoting the Rise of Skywalker and other stuff. I don't know. But people were enthusiastic about Bond. So here we are. Yeah, I had the same results on Facebook. I just put up the thing, and everybody who chimed in, I would say, yeah, probably about the same. 70 to 80% of the people who chimed in said 007. So I'm going to do Casino Royale. It was the very first Ian Fleming James Bond novel, so it seemed like an obvious spot to start. And I'm going to start with, I printed out the Wikipedia article. I'm going to read some background information on the novel. This one is pretty long, but I'd like to go through all of it because I think it's all pretty interesting. The film that we all know and love now came out in 2006, but the book was written in 1953, and of course there's a bunch of reasons why the good version of the film didn't exist till over 50 years later. But also the background information I'm going to read to you here has a lot of interesting information on Ian Fleming himself, like his background, how he kind of came up with the character and what he based the character on. And it also has, obviously, background on the character and some background on basically like the attitudes of post-war Britain, which kind of led to them, having this sort of, this sort of sense of like we need to puff ourselves up because we're losing our standard or our, our standing. We're losing our standing in the world was sort of what was happening to the British Empire post World War II. And so, part of it is, Ian Fleming invented this character, James Bond, who's, smooth, smart, and action-packed, all this stuff. So, I'm going to take a sip of this martini here. Thank you, Mom, for making me a martini. Lovely mother and bartender. Let's put a record on, since my phone is my only watch or clock, and that's being used to film right now. I'm going to do what I normally do and play a record and use that to kind of keep track of the time. So this, musical selection today, I'm thinking I'm probably going to dip into this box a lot. If you listen to my Star Wars, you heard some of these already, but this is mood music for listening and relaxation. And today we're going to do record number 4, which is Cocktail Piano. This is one of the records I didn't play during Star Wars because Cocktail Piano didn't seem like the right vibe for Star Wars, but you know what? For Casino Royale, it does. So let's get that going. And we'll get into Casino Royale background information. Alright. Casino Royale is the first novel by the British author Ian Fleming. Published in 1953, it is the first James Bond book and it paved the way for a further 11 novels and 2 short story collections by Fleming, followed by numerous continuation Bond novels by other authors. The story concerns the British secret agent James Bond gambling at the casino in Royale to bankrupt Le Chiffre, the treasurer of a French union and a member of the Russian Secret Service. Bond is supported in his endeavors by Vesper Lynd, a member of his own service, as well as Felix Leiter of the CIA and René Mathis of the French DNA Bureau. You're going to have to pardon my French pronunciations throughout this whole thing. I did not study any French, nor did I do any brush-ups before starting this, so I'm going to slaughter some words throughout this book, I'm sure. Fleming used his wartime experiences as a member of the Naval Intelligence Division and the people he met during his work to provide plot elements. The character of Bond also reflected many of Fleming's personal tastes. Fleming wrote the draft in early 1952 at his Goldeneye estate in Jamaica while awaiting his marriage. He was initially unsure whether the work was suitable for publication, but was assured by his friend, the novelist William Plomer, that the novel had promise. Within the spy storyline, Casino Royale deals with themes of Britain's position in the world, particularly the relationship with the US in the light of the defections to the Soviet Union of British agents Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean. The book was given broadly positive reviews by critics at the time and sold out in less than a month after its initial UK release on April 13, 1953, although US sales upon release a year later were much slower. Since publication, Casino Royale has appeared as a comic strip in the Daily Express and been adapted for the screen 3 times. A 1954 episode of the CBS television series Climax, it's Climax with an exclamation mark, Climax, with Barry Nelson as an American Bond, a 1967 film version with David Niven playing Sir James Bond, and a 2006 film in the Eon Productions film series starring Daniel Craig as James Bond, as seen here. I'm going to skip over the plot portion of this and go right to background. We're going to get to the plot when we read the book, so that is unnecessary information right now. Alright. Ian Fleming, born in 1908, was a son of Valentine Fleming, a wealthy banker and MP who died in action on the Western Front in May 1917. Educated at Eton Sandhurst and briefly the universities of Munich and Geneva, Fleming moved through several jobs before he was recruited by Rear Admiral John Godfrey, the Director of Naval Intelligence, to become his personal assistant. Fleming joined the organization full-time in August 1939 with the code name 17F. That's much less attractive than 007. And worked for them throughout the war. Early in 1939, he began an affair with Anne O'Neill, who was married to the 3rd Baron O'Neill. In 1942, Fleming attended an Anglo-American intelligence summit in Jamaica, and despite the constant heavy rain during his visit, he decided to live on the island once the war was over. His friend Ivar Bryce helped him find a plot of land in St. Mary Parish, where in 1945, Fleming had a house built, which he named Goldeneye. The name of the house and estate has many possible sources. Fleming mentioned both his wartime, Operation Goldeneye, and Carson McCullers' 1941 novel, Reflections in a Golden Eye, which described the use of British naval bases in the Caribbean by the US Navy. Upon Fleming's demobilization in May 1945, he became the foreign manager in the Kemsley newspaper group, which at the time opened the Sunday Times. In this role, he oversaw the paper's worldwide network of correspondents. His contract allowed him to take 2 months' holiday every winter in Jamaica. In 1948, Charteris gave birth to Fleming's, that must be the woman he married, gave birth to Fleming's daughter Mary, who was stillborn. And she and Fleming became engaged shortly in 1951. Sorry, I told you I'm already doing some pronunciation mess-ups with names. Fleming had previously mentioned to friends that he wanted to write a spy novel, but it was not until early 1952, to distract himself from the forthcoming nuptials, that he began to write Casino Royale at his Goldeneye estate in Jamaica on February 17th. He typed out 2,000 words in the morning, directly from his own experiences and imagination, and finished work on the manuscript in March 1952. It was a pattern he retained for future Bond books, In May 1963, he wrote a piece for Books and Bookmen magazine in which he said, "I write for about 3 hours in the morning, and I do another hour's work between 6 and 7 in the evening. I never correct anything, and I never go back to see what I've written. By following my formula, you write 2,000 words a day." Back in London, Fleming had his manuscript, which he described as his dreadful oafish opus. There's a tongue twister. Dreadful oafish opus. Retyped by Joan Howe, his red-haired secretary at the Times, on whom the character Miss Moneypenny was partly based. Claire Blanchard, a former girlfriend, advised him not to publish the book, or at least to do so under a pseudonym. During the book's final draft stages, Fleming allowed his friend and later editor William Plomer to see a copy, and remarked, I really am thoroughly ashamed of it. After rifling through this muck, you will probably never speak to me again, but I've got to take that chance." Despite this, Plomer thought the book had sufficient promise and sent a copy to the publishing house Jonathan Cape. At first they were unenthusiastic, but were persuaded to publish on the recommendation of Fleming's older brother Peter, an established travel writer whose books they managed. Although Fleming provided no dates within his novels, two writers have identified different timelines based on events and situations within the novel series as a whole. John Griswold and Henry Chancellor, both of whom have written books on behalf of Ian Fleming Publications, put the events of Casino Royale in 1951. Griswold allows a possible second time frame and considers the story to have taken place in either May to July 1951 or May to July 1952. Then we move on to development. Development. Plot inspirations. Casino Royale was inspired by certain incidents that took place during Fleming's wartime career of the Naval Intelligence Division, or by events of which he was aware. On a trip to Portugal en route to the United States, Fleming and the NID director Admiral Godfrey went to the Estoril Casino. Because of Portugal's neutral status, Estoril's population had been swelled by spies and agents from warring regimes. Fleming claimed that while there, he was cleaned out by a chief German agent at a table playing Chemin de Fer. Godfrey told a different story, that Fleming only played Portuguese businessmen and after German agents. The failed attempt to kill Bond, spoiler alert, James Bond doesn't die in this book, at Royale was inspired by Fleming's knowledge of the attempted assassination of Franz von Papen, Vice-Chancellor of Germany, and an ambassador under Hitler. Both Papen and Bond survived their assassination attempts, carried out by Bulgarians, because trees protected them from blasts. The torture scene, again, spoiler alert, which I forgot about this scene, the torture scene in which, wow, this is going to be interesting to read in the book, because it's going to be uncomfortable to read right now. The torture scene in which Bond's genitals are thrashed while he is strapped to a bottomless chair was a version of a French-Moroccan torture technique, passeur à la mandoline, in which the steel string of a mandolin was used to slice in half the testicles of British wartime agents. Fleming also included 4 references in the novel to Red Indians, including twice on the last page, which came from a unit of commandos known as Number 30 Commando or 30 Assault Unit, composed of specialist intelligence troops. The unit was Fleming's idea, and he nicknamed the troops the Red Indians, although they disliked the name. Alright. That's one thing, as a huge fan of the Bond movies, when you go back and watch some of the stuff from the 60s and 70s and even 80s and 90s at this point, you know, there are certain things that are either racially or culturally insensitive, and obviously there's a lot of misogyny and sexism in the films. So I read all these books, I don't know, probably, well, mid-90s anyway. I was in high school when I bought all the Bond books, and I haven't read them since then, so I'm not sure exactly what we're getting into. I do remember this is one of the books that the movie actually follows pretty close to the book. So, but anyway, carrying on now. Characters. The lead character of Casino Royale is James Bond, an agent of the Secret Service. Fleming initially named the character James Secretan before he appropriated the name of James Bond, author of the ornithology guide Birds of the West Indies. Fleming explained to the ornithologist's wife that this brief, unromantic Anglo-Saxon and yet very masculine name was just what I needed, and so a second James Bond was born. He further explained that when I wrote the first one in 1953, I wanted Bond to be an extremely dull, uninteresting man to whom things happened. I wanted him to be a blunt instrument. When I was casting around for a name for my protagonist, I thought, by God, James Bond is the dullest name I've ever heard. Fleming decided that Bond should resemble both the American singer Hoegy Carmichael and himself. And in the novel, Lind remarks that Bond reminds me rather of a Hoegy Carmichael, but there is something cold and ruthless. According to Andrew Lysette, Fleming's biographer, within the first few pages, Fleming had introduced most of Bond's idiosyncrasies and trademarks, which included his looks, his Bentley, and his smoking and drinking habits. The full details of Bond's martini were kept until Chapter 7 of the book, and Bond eventually named it The Vesper, after Vesper Lind. Bond's order to be served in a deep champagne goblet was for 3 measures of Gordon's, 1 of vodka, half a measure of Quina Lillet, shake it very well until it's ice cold, and add a large thin slice of lemon peel. I think this is the only book that he drinks the Vesper in, and they also put it in the movie. After that, he just goes to the vodka martinis, I believe. When we get to that part of the book, maybe I'll have to have my mom bartender make me the Vesper. Mom, I know you're watching, so I'll have to get the ingredients for you, or learn how to make it myself. I can do that. Speaking of Bond's origins, Fleming said that he was a compound of all the secret agents and the commando types I met during the war. Although the author gave many of his own traits to the character, Bond's tastes are often taken from Fleming's own, as is some of his behavior. Fleming used the casino to introduce Bond in his first novel because skill at gambling and knowledge of how to behave in a casino were seen as attributes of a gentleman. Lysette sees much of Bond's character as being wish fulfillment by Fleming. Bond's superior, M, was largely based on Godfrey, Fleming's NID superior officer. Godfrey was known for his bellicose his bellicose temperament. One of the likely models for Le Chiffre was the influential English occultist, astrologer, mystic, and ceremonial magician Aleister Crowley, on whose physical features Fleming based Le Chiffre's. Crowley's tastes, especially in sadomasochism, were also ascribed to Le Chiffre. As Fleming's biographer Henry Chancellor notes, when Le Chiffre goes to work on Bond's testicles with a carpet beater and a carving knife, the sinister figure of Aleister Crowley is there lurking in the background. Now we move on to style. Fleming later said of his work, "While thrillers may not be literature with a capital L, it is possible to write what I best describe as thrillers designed to read as literature." He used well-known brand names and everyday details to produce a sense of realism, which the author Kingsley Amis called the Fleming effect. Amis described it as the imaginative use of information whereby the pervading fantastic nature of Bond's world is bolted down to some sort of reality, or at least counterbalanced. Within the text, the novelist Raymond Benson, who later wrote a series of Bond novels, identifies what he describes as the Fleming sweep, the use of hooks at the end of chapters to heighten tension and pull the reader into the next. The hooks continue with what the novelist Anthony Burgess calls a heightened journalistic style, to produce a speed of narrative which hustles the reader past each danger point of mockery. The essayist Umberto Eco, in his 1979 examination of Bond books, The Narrative Structure of Ian Fleming, considered that Fleming has a rhythm, a polish, a certain sensuous feeling for words. That is not to say that Fleming is an artist, yet he writes with art. When examining the passage relating to the death of Le Chiffre, spoiler alert, the bad guy dies, Eco wrote that there is a Baroque feeling for the image, a total adaptation off the image without emotional comment, and use of words that designate things with accuracy. And he went on to conclude that Fleming is more literate than he gives one to understand. Okay. Casino Royale was written... Oh, sorry, this moves on to the themes section. Casino Royale was written after and was heavily influenced by the Second World War. Britain was still an imperial power, and the Western and Eastern blocs were engaged in the Cold War. The journalist William Cook observes that with the decline in power of the British Empire, Bond pandered to Britain's inflated and increasingly insecure self-image, flattering us with the fantasy that Britannia could still punch above her weight. The cultural historians Janet Woolcott and Tony Bennett, different Tony Bennett, I'm guessing, agree and consider that Bond embodied the imaginary possibility that England might once again be placed at the center of world affairs during a period when its world power status was visibly and rapidly declining. In 1953, parts of central London, including Oxford Street and High Holborn, still had uncleared bomb sites, and sweets had ceased being rationed, but coal and other food items were still regulated. According to the Times journalist and historian Ben McIntyre, Bond was the ideal antidote to Britain's post-war austerity, rationing, and the looming premonition of lost power. Casino Royale deals with the question of Anglo-American relations, reflecting the real-world central role of the U.S. in the defense of the West. The academic Jeremy Black points to the 1951 defections of two members of MI6, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean, to the Soviet Union, as having a major impact on how Britain was poorly viewed in U.S. intelligence circles. Fleming was aware of this tension between the two countries, but he did not focus on it too strongly, and Bond and Leiter's warm relationship did not reflect the reality of the US-UK relationship. Amos, in his exploration of Bond in the James Bond dossier, pointed out that Leiter is such a non-entity as a piece of characterization. He, the American, takes orders from Bond, the Britisher, and that Bond is constantly doing better than he. The journalist and author Christopher Hitchens observed that the central paradox of the classic Bond stories is that although superficially devoted to the Anglo-American war against communism, they are full of contempt and resentment for America and Americans. David Seed is, in his examination of spy fiction, disagrees, and writes that while Bond beats Le Chiffre, his activities are constantly supported by American agencies, financing, and know-how. The treachery of Le Chiffre, with the overtones of a fifth column. Fifth column is something I had to look up. It's essentially basically like a deep state, I guess, like the brains behind, or hidden behind the brains, whatever. They said it's like you have like a military unit or something, but within that unit there's a secret unit that's running their own show, kind of behind the scenes. So fifth column. The treachery of Le Chiffre, with the overtones of a fifth column, struck a chord with the largely British readership, as communist influence in the trade unions had been an issue in the press and parliament at the time. Britain had also suffered from defections to the Soviet Union from two MI6 operatives, who were part of the Cambridge 5 spy ring that betrayed Western secrets to the Soviets. Thus, Lysette observes that Casino Royale can be seen as Fleming's attempt to reflect the disturbing moral ambiguity of a post-war world that could produce traitors like Burgess and McLean. The journalist and writer Matthew Parker observes that with the defection of these two spies, so recent to the publication, it was perhaps the closest Fleming came to a Jean Le Carré-style spy story. Chancellor sees the moral ambiguity of the Cold War reflected in the novel. Benson considers the most obvious theme of the novel to be a good versus evil. Parker agrees and highlights a conversation between Bond and Mathis in the chapter titled The Nature of Evil, in which Bond says, by Le Chiffre's evil existence, he was creating a norm of badness by which alone, an opposite norm of goodness could exist. The subject was also dealt with by the academic Beth Butterfield in an examination of Bond from an existentialist viewpoint. In light of Bond's conversation, Butterfield identifies a crisis of confidence in Bond's character, where he has moved beyond good and evil, to the point where he does his job not because of principles, but to pursue personal battles. Eco comes to the same conclusion, stating that Bond abandons the treacherous life of moral mediation and psychological anger with all the dangers they entail. Black also identifies a mechanism Fleming uses in Casino Royale and in subsequent Bond novels, which is to use the evil of his opponents both as a justification of his actions and as a device to foil their plans. Black refers to the episode of the attempted assassination of Bond by Bulgarian assassins, which results in their, spoiler alert, own deaths. Okay, I swear we're coming to pretty close to the end here. We're moving on to publication and reception. Casino Royale was first released on April 13th, 1953 in the UK as a hardback edition by publishers Jonathan Cape, with a cover devised by Fleming. Cape printed 4,728 copies. That's a kind of a random number. 4,728 copies of Casino Royale, which sold out in less than a month. A second print run the same month also sold out, as did a third run of more than 8,000 books published in May of 1954. The sales figures were strong enough for Cape to offer Fleming a 3-book deal. In 1955, April, Pan Books issued a paperback version that sold 41,000 copies in the first year. In the US, 3 publishers turned the book down before Macmillan Publishing co-offered Fleming a deal. Casino Royale was published March 23, 1954 in the US, but sales were poor, totaling only 4,000 copies across the entire US during the course of the year. When the novel was released as a US paperback in 1955, it was retitled by publisher American Popular Library. Fleming's suggestion for a new title, The 00 Agent and The Deadly Gamble, were disregarded in favor of You Asked for It. That's terrible. But this marketing ploy failed to raise the interest. The Popular Library version also changed Bond's name, calling him Jimmy Bond. Wow, that's horrible. Let's see. The side of my record has ended. So let me just take a moment and flip the record over. I'm guessing we're not going to get too deep into the novel today, but I hope you're finding this background information interesting, because I certainly did. All right, let's see. Where were we? Publication and reception. All right, publication history. Casino Royale, wait, did I just do that one? Yes, I did. Critical reception, there we go. Hugh Eilson Fawcett, writing in the Manchester Guardian, thought that Casino Royale was a first-rate thriller with a breathtaking plot. Although he considered the book to be schoolboy stuff, he felt the novel was galvanized into life by the hard brilliance of the storytelling. Alan Ross, writing in the Times Literary Supplement, wrote that Casino Royale was an extremely engaging affair, in that the especial charm is the high poetry with which he invests the green Baez lagoons of the casino tables. He concluded that the book was both exciting and extremely civilized. Reviewing for the Listener, Simon Raven believed that Fleming was a kind of supersonic John Buchanan, but he was somewhat dismissive of the plot, observing that it is a brilliant but improbable notion that includes a deal of champagne drinking, bomb throwing, relentless pitting of wits, etc. With a cretinous love affair, Raven also dismissed Bond as an infantile creation, but did allow that Fleming tells a good story with strength and distinction. His creation of a scene, both visually and emotionally, is of a very high order indeed. John Betjeman, writing in the Daily Telegraph, considered that Ian Fleming has discovered the secret of the narrative art, which is to work up to climax unrevealed at the end of each chapter. Thus, the reader has to go on reading. Basically sounds like the serialized television we watch these days. Publishers Jonathan Cape included many of the reviews on their advertisements for the book, which appeared in a number of national newspapers. The reviews included those from the Sunday Times, which concluded that Fleming was the best new English thriller writer since Eric Ambler, and the Observer, which advised their readers, "Don't miss this." The critic for Time magazine examined Raymond Chandler's The Long Goodbye alongside Casino Royale. He praised Casino Royale, saying that Fleming keeps his incidents and characters spinning through their paces like juggling balls. The Time reviewer went on to say that, as for Bond, he might be Philip Marlowe's younger brother, except that he never takes coffee for a bracer, just one large martini laced with vodka. Writing for the New York Times, Anthony Boucher wrote that the book belongs pretty much to the private eye school of fiction. He praised the first part, saying that Fleming manages to make Baccarat clear even to one who's never played it, and produced as exciting a gambling sequence as I've ever read. But then he decides to pad out the book to novel length, and leads the weary reader through a set of tough cliches to an ending which surprises nobody save Operative 007. You should certainly begin this book, but you might as well stop when the Baccarat game is over. There's a review. Alright, we're nearing the end. We're getting down to adaptations now. Adaptations. In 1954, CBS paid Ian Fleming $1,000 to adapt Casino Royale into a one-hour television adventure as part of its Climax series. The episode aired live on October 21st, 1954, and starred Barry Nelson as secret agent Card Sense James Jimmy Bond, and Peter Lorre as Le Chiffre. A brief tutorial on Baccarat is given at the beginning of the show by the presenter of the program, William Lundigan, to enable viewers to understand a game which was not popular in America at the time. For this Americanized version of the story, Bond is an American agent described as working for Combined Intelligence, while the character Leiter from the original novel is British, renamed Clarence Leiter. The agent for Station S, Mathis, does not appear as such. His surname is given to the leading lady named Valerie Mathis instead of Vesper Lind. In March 1955, Ian Fleming sold the film rights of Casino Royale to the producer Gregory Ratoff for $6,000. After Ratoff's death, producer Charles K. Feldman represented Ratoff's widow and obtained the rights to make a film version. Feldman decided the best way to profit from the film rights was to make a satirical version, which was produced and released in 1967 by Columbia Pictures. The film, which cast David Niven as Bond, was made with 5 credited directors plus 1 uncredited, and a cast that included Peter Sellers, Ursula Andress, Orson Welles, and Woody Allen. The 1967 version is described by the British Film Institute as an incoherent all-star comedy. Casino Royale was the first James Bond novel to be adapted as a daily comic strip. It was published in the Daily Express and syndicated worldwide. The strip ran from July 7, 1958 to December 13, 1958, and was written by Anthony Hearn and illustrated by John McCluskey. To aid the Daily Express in illustrating Bond, Fleming commissioned an artist to create a sketch of what he believed James Bond to look like. McCluskey felt that Fleming's 007 looked too outdated and pre-war, and changed Bond to give him a more masculine look. A graphic novel adaptation of the book was released by Dynamite Entertainment in April of 2018, written by Van Jensen and illustrated by Dennis Calero. Following the 1967 adaptations, the rights to the film remained with Columbia Films until 1989, when the studio and the rights to their intellectual property portfolio was acquired by the Japanese company Sony. In 1999, following legal actions between Sony Pictures Entertainment and MGM United Artists, Sony traded the rights to Casino Royale for MGM's partial rights to Spider-Man. This led to Eon Productions making the 2006 film Casino Royale. The film stars Daniel Craig as Bond, supported by Eva Green as Vesper Lind, and Mads Mikkelsen as Le Chiffre. Judi Dench returns to her 5th Bond film as Bond's superior, M. Casino Royale is a reboot, showing Bond at the beginning of his career and as a 00 agent, and overall stays true to the original novel. Thus concludes our background information. Thank you for being patient with me there, folks. So as I said, it must have been, I don't know, when eBay was new, so maybe 96, 97, around then, is when I purchased all my James Bond novels. I went on eBay. One of the first things I ever bought on eBay was a lot of James Bond books. I think I got, out of the 11 Ian Fleming novels, I think I got 8 of them, or something like that, and then I ended up just kind of filling in the blanks, by going to bookstores and getting the ones I didn't have after that. So I think at this point, I might still be missing one of the Ian Fleming novels, but I've got most of them. And I read them all back then, but I have not read them since. I have watched the movies hundreds of times each. And I would say there are very few of them that follow the books that closely. Out of memory, the ones that follow the books the most closely are initially From Russia with Love is very close to the book. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is very close to the book. I think Thunderball is pretty close to the book, because that has its own kind of story. Thunderball was the first one that was written as a screenplay first, and then a book, and then a screenplay from the book. There's a whole thing with Thunderball that maybe one day we'll get into. But yeah, and then in 2006 they made Casino Royale, and even though it's a modern adaptation of the story, they did manage to stay pretty close to the book, as I recall. But we're going to find out how close as we get started. So this is my copy of the book, and the cover of it, I don't know if you can see this color illustration here. I'll hold it up to each of these cameras for a second. But the portrayal of James Bond on the cover looks, I would say he looks more like Gregory Peck than any of the actors that actually played him. Maybe like a little bit like George Lazenby, but I see more of a Gregory Peck. And Vesper Lynd looks more like Linda Carter than Eva Green. But all right, here you go for, sorry your text is backwards to you on Instagram, folks, but here's your Facebook cover. And this version of it, or this copy of it, I should say, was published by Bantam Books. And it says in here that the Bantam edition was published in May of 1971. So this book is May of 1971. Alright, so I'm going to get into the novel now. And looks like we've probably only got about 10 or 15 minutes left, but you know, we'll get started and we'll pick up tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern, and we'll do this every weekday until the book's done. So, I should take one more sip of the old martini. Cheers, everybody. Alright, Casino Royale by Ian Fleming. Chapter 1, The Secret Agent. Oh, I should also say, the text in this book is really small. I was going to wear my contacts, because, you know, I wanted to assume the character a little bit, and James Bond only wears glasses when he's undercover as a nerd. But, I don't know, my contacts take a while to get settled in my eyes, and I looked at this text and I was like, oh no, this is definitely a glasses book. Alright, Chapter 1, The Secret Agent. The scent and smoke and sweat of a casino are nauseating at 3 in the morning. Then the soul erosion produced by high gambling, a compost of greed and fear and nervous tension, becomes unbearable, and the senses awake and revolt from it. James Bond suddenly knew that he was tired. He always knew when his body or his mind had had enough, and he always acted on the knowledge. This helped him to avoid the staleness and the sensual bluntness that breeds mistakes. He shifted himself unobtrusively away from the roulette he had been playing and went to stand for a moment at the brass rail which surrounded breast high the top table in the salle privé. Le Chiffre was still playing and still apparently winning. There was an untidy pile of flecked 100 mil plaques in front of him. In the shadow of his thick left arm there nestled a discreet stack of the big yellow ones worth 500,000 francs each. Bond watched the curious, impressive profile for a time, and then he shrugged his shoulders to lighten his thoughts and moved away. The barrier surrounding the case comes as high as your chin, and the cashier, who is generally nothing more than a minor bank clerk, sits on a stool and dips into his piles of notes and plaques. These are ranged on shelves. There, on a level behind the protecting barrier... They are on a level behind the protecting barrier with your groin. The cashier has a coche and a gun to protect him, and to heave over the barrier and steal some notes, then vault back and get out of the casino through the passages and doors would be impossible, and the cashiers generally work in pairs. Bond reflected on the problem as he collected the sheaf of 100,000 and then the sheafs of 10,000 franc notes. With another part of his mind, he had a vision of tomorrow's regular morning meeting of the casino committee. Monsieur Le Chiffre made 2 million. He played his usual game. Miss Fairchild made $1 million in an hour and then left. She executed 3 bancos of Monsieur Le Chiffre within an hour and then left. She played with coolness. Monsieur Le Vicomte de Villeurion made 1 million too at roulette. He was playing the maximum on the first and last dozens. He was lucky. Then the Englishman, Mr. Bond, increased his winnings to exactly 3 million over the 2 days. He was playing a progressive system on red at table 5. Duclos, the chef de partie, has the details. It seems that he is persevering and pays in maximums. He has luck. His nerves seem good. On the soirée, the chemin de fer won X, the baccarat won Y, and the roulette won Z. The boulet, which was again badly frequented, still makes its expenses. Merci, Monsieur Xavier. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Or something like that, thought Bond, as he pushed his way through the swing doors of the C'est Privé and noted to the bored men in evening clothes whose job it is to bar your entry and your exit in the electric foot switch, which can lock the door at any hint of trouble. And the casino committee would balance its books and break up its homes or cafes for lunch. As for robbing the case, in which Bond himself was not personally concerned, but only interested, he reflected that it would take 10 good men, and they would certainly have to kill 1 or 2 employees, and that anyway you probably couldn't find 10 non-squeal killers in France, or in any other country for that matter. As he gave 1,000 francs to the vestiaire and walked down the steps of the casino, Bond made up his mind that Le Chiffre would in no circumstances try to rob the case. And he put the contingency out of his mind. Instead, he explored his present physical sensations. He felt the dry, uncomfortable gravel under his evening shoes, the bad, harsh taste in his mouth, and the slight sweat under his arms. He could feel his eyes filling their sockets. The front of his face, his nose, and antrum were congested. He breathed the sweet night air deeply and focused his senses and his wits. He wanted to know if anyone had searched his room since he had left it for dinner. He walked across the broad boulevard and through the gardens to the Hotel Splendide. He smiled at the concierge, who gave him his key, number 45, on the first floor, and took the cable. It was from Jamaica, and read Kingston, J.A., and there's a whole series of X's. Bond, Splendide, Royale, Sign Infinior, Havana Cigar Production, all Cuban factories, 1915. 10 million, repeat, 10 million, stop. Hope this figure you require regards. De Silva. This meant that 10 million francs was on the way to him. It was the reply to a request Bond had sent that afternoon through Paris to his headquarters in London, asking for more funds. Paris had spoken to London, where Clements, the head of Bond's department, had spoken to M, who had smiled wryly and told the broker to fix it with the Treasury. Bond had once worked in Jamaica, and his cover on the Royale assignment was that of a very rich client of Monsieur Caffrey, the principal import and export firm of Jamaica. So he was being controlled through Jamaica, through a taciturn man who was head of the picture desk on the Daily Gleaner, the famous newspaper of the Caribbean. This man on the Gleaner, whose name was Fawcett, had been bookkeeper for one of the leading turtle fisheries on the Cayman Islands, one of the men from the Caymans who had volunteered on the outbreak of the war. He had ended up as a paymaster's clerk in a small naval intelligence organization in Malta. At the end of the war, when with a heavy heart he was about to return to the Caymans, he was spotted by the section of the Secret Service concerned with the Caribbean. He was strenuously trained in photography and some other arts, and with the quiet connivance of an influential man in Jamaica, he found his way to the picture desk of the Gleaner. In the intervals between sifting photographs submitted by the great agencies Keystone, Wide World, Universal, INP, and Reuters Photo, he would get peremptory instructions by telephone from a man he had never met to carry out certain simple operations requiring nothing but absolute discretion, speed, and accuracy. For these occasional services he received £20 a month, paid into his account with the Royal Bank of Canada by a fictitious relative in England. Fawcett's present assignment was to relay immediately to Bond full rates the texts of messages which he received at home by telephone from his anonymous contact. He'd been told by the contact that nothing he would be asked to send would arouse the suspicion of the Jamaican post office, so he was not surprised to find himself suddenly appointed string correspondent for the Maritime Press in the photo agency, with press collect facilities to France and England, on a further monthly retainer of £10. He felt secure and encouraged, had visions of a BEM, and made the first payment on a Morris Minor. He also bought a green eyeshade, which he had long coveted, and which helped him to impose his personality on the picture desk. Some of this background to his cable passed through Bond's mind. He was used to oblique control and rather liked it. He felt it feather-bedded him a little, allowed him to give or take an hour or two in his communications with M. He knew that this was probably a fallacy, that probably there was another member of the service in Royale who was reporting independently, but it did give the illusion that he wasn't only 150 miles across the channel from that deadly office building near Regent's Park, being watched and judged by those few cold brains that made the whole show work. Just as Fawcett, the Cayman Islander in Kingston, knew that if he bought that Morris Minor outright instead of signing the hire purchase agreement, someone in London would probably know and want to know where the money had come from. Bond read the cable twice. He tore a telegraph form off the pad on the desk. Why give them carbon copies? And wrote his reply in capital letters. Thanks. Information should suffice. Bond. He handed this to the concierge and put the cable signed De Silva in his pocket. The employers, if any, of the concierge could bribe a copy out of the local post office if the concierge hadn't already steamed the envelope open or read the cable upside down in Bond's hands. He took his key and said good night and turned to the stairs. Shaking his head at the liftman, Bond knew what an obliging danger signal a lift could be. He didn't expect anyone to be moving on the first floor, but he preferred to be prudent. Walking quietly up on the balls of his feet, he regretted the hubris of his reply to M via Jamaica. As a gambler, he knew it was a mistake to rely on too small a capital. Anyway, M probably wouldn't let him have any more. He shrugged his shoulders and turned off the stairs into the corridor and walked softly to the door of his room. Bond knew exactly where the switch was, and it was with one flow of emotion that he stood on the threshold with the door full open, the light on, and a gun in his hand. The safe, empty room sneered at him. He ignored the half-open door at the bathroom, and after locking himself in, he turned up the bed light and the mirror light and threw his gun on the settee beside the window. Then he bent down and inspected one of his own black hairs, which still lay undisturbed where he had left it before dinner, wedged into the drawer of the writing desk. Next he examined a faint trace of talcum powder on the inner rim of the porcelain handle of the clothes cupboard. It appeared immaculate. He went into the bathroom, lifted the cover of the lavatory cistern, and verified the level of the water against a small scratch on the copper ballcock. Doing all this, inspecting these minute burglar alarms, did not make him feel foolish or self-conscious. He was a secret agent, and still alive thanks to his exact attention to detail of his profession. Routine precautions were to him no more unreasonable than they would be to a deep-sea diver or a test pilot, or to any man earning danger money. Satisfied that his room had not been searched while he was at the casino, Bond undressed and took a cold shower. Then he lit his 17th cigarette of the day and sat down at the writing table with the thick wad of his stake money and winnings beside him, and entered some figures into a small notebook. Over the 2 days' play he was up exactly 3 million francs. In London he had been issued with 10 million, and he had asked London for a further 10. With this on its way to the local branch of the Credit Lyonnais, his working capital amounted to 23 million francs, or some £23,000. For a few moments Bond sat motionless, gazing out of the window across the dark sea. Then he shoved the bundle of banknotes under the pillow of the ornate single bed, cleaned his teeth, and turned out the lights, and climbed with relief between the harsh French sheets. For 10 minutes he lay on his side, reflecting on the events of the day. Then he turned over and focused his mind toward the tunnel of sleep. His last action was to slip his right hand under the pillow until it rested under the butt of the .38 Colt Police Positive with the sawn barrel. Then he slept, and with the warmth and humor of his eyes extinguished, his features relapsed into a taciturn mask, ironical, brutal, and cold. Thus concludes Chapter 1, and our record is over. So I think that will conclude our reading for the day. We're going to pick up tomorrow, Chapter 2, and I'm sure we'll get much deeper into the book than we did today. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate it.